Welcome to my YouTube channel. My guest on the program is former gang leader and now advisor to the government, Sheldon Thomas. Sheldon Thomas, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to have you here. I know a little bit about your story, and it's an important story to tell. Your parents came from Jamaica.
That's right.
And then you were born in London.
London, yeah.
So you grew up in London.
Yep.
Growing up in London, did you experience racism?
Yes, we experienced racism in a real bad way, and it wasn't exclusive to me. Many of my generation, we've faced such extreme racism. And one of the stories I can talk about, and that's in my mind so rigidly because it was the most traumatic experience, because up until then we hadn't experienced anything. And this was 1974. And it was the year of the World Cup in Germany. And we was on our way into the park, and most black kids didn't support England at the time because there wasn't any black players. So we supported Brazil because Brazil had black players. And we all took the names of different Brazilian stars, Rivelino, Jairzinho, Pelé, and all of those kind of guys, and Testai and all of that. So we was on the way to the park, and as we was going to the park, two police officers was coming down. And as they approached us, one of them shouted out, "Gollywog." Now, none of us even knew what the word gollywog. This is 1974. We're about 9 years old, 10 years old. We've never even heard that word. So I looked up, we all looked up, but they looked like they wanted to hurt us. And we just little tiny kids, and they looked massive. And so Kennington became a place of, how are we going to navigate ourselves? Just get into the park.
Yeah, but how are you going to survive?
Just get into the park. Like, if it wasn't what name calling, if it wasn't being thrust in the neck, it just became like a kind of obstacle course that you have to try and navigate just to get to the park. And then it got worse because our parents weren't like the parents of today, where they kind of looked at the schools and was making sure that the schools was the right one. It wasn't like that. Back in those days, they just went for the first school. And the school they put us in was in the area of racism, which was Elephant and Castle. And so we was walking to school from Kennington, having to pass police stations and the National Front just to get to school. And some people would look at that and think, wow, did that really happen? Yes, because anytime we was going to school, it wasn't a case of just getting to school. It was a case of, are we going to make it to school on time? Because the chances are we're going to get roughed up by the police or chased by the National Front. Now, thank God the National Front didn't get up too early in the morning, so they were later in the day. But the police, they'd be at the top of the road, so we have to go down another road. And sooner or later, they began to work out which way we're going. And every time we was going to school, they'd name call us, they'd throw egg at us. And when we kind of shouted back at them, because obviously we're getting older now, we're kind of like 11, they'd jump out the car and, threaten to use their baton on us. So the racism that we were facing, me and Christopher, a normal kid in today's time would have killed a police officer.
Yes.
It made me realize that we're in a war. We're in a constant war. And that constant war made us more angry. And I'll be honest, by the time I was 13, I wanted to kill white people.
Yes, because you were receiving all this racism, abuse from the police, which was hugely surprising, but also from many others, including the National Front. And so, I mean, as you said, you're only a teenager, and so you then thought, I need a support. I need some kind of gang, which you called a posse, didn't you?
That's why you remember. That's right.
And that's how you began
Yeah.
to be part of a gang. Just tell us a little bit about that whole gang concept. What was that about?
So basically, when we would go to school, all of us would be talking about what happened to us with the police and the National Front at the weekend. And then I came up with the idea that we got to protect ourselves because we can't keep going out and being attacked and being brutalized physically and mentally. So I decided that we need to start a posse, what today they call gangs.
Yes.
So it actually started in school, okay? And so basically what it was that we would not go anywhere on our own anymore. We would walk in a posse. Jamaica had a posse called the Shower Posse, which was a very violent gang. So we wanted to link ourselves to them. So I formed a posse in order to defend ourselves. And I think that was the beginning of our downfall because we began to self-destruct. Because with no outlet of anger, because we couldn't go home to our parents because my mum and dad were just a little bit clueless. They were more passive. They were more interested in turning a blind eye to racism.
Yeah.
They were more interested in just getting on because they believed England saved them from poverty and all of that. So they had this concept of don't upset no one in Britain so that we can get on. And us being the first generation born to West Indian parents in the 60s, we didn't want that anymore. We didn't want that concept. We believed that, you know, we have a right to be treated decently. And when I formed the posse, I think everything went pear-shaped in my mental thinking. I began to have a dislike, a real hatred towards white people, and we all did, to the point where it would just take a police officer to look at us the wrong way and we would attack him.
But the thing is, Sheldon, you were all teenagers.
Yes.
Which is remarkable. I mean, some of you were 12, 13, 14, and you would go to a national front in order to fight people.
Yeah.
So violence increased, and then on top of that, you got involved in drugs and drug dealing, and before long, guns.
Yeah.
So there was a real escalation.
Yeah, 100%. And this is what happens when you're so hangry and so full of hate. Hate goes into these other realms. And so what happened was, because we were so angry, it was easy for the Jamaican gangs or the Jamaican posses to groom us. Today they use the word grooming, but back then it wasn't grooming. No. It was just like, come with us. And the Jamaicans knew the way to get us was to say, listen, they don't like you because of the colour of your skin, bruv. Come and do this. Now, I personally wasn't a drug dealer. I was what you would call an enforcer. Okay, so an enforcer is somebody that people would go to extract money from somebody or to beat somebody up. So because of my violent nature and the hatred I had for the system and white people and the National Front, a lot of the gang would use that to say, come and deal with this guy for us. You know what I'm saying? So for me, it was a case of, I was like the enforcer.
And that involved a lot of violence.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about breaking kneecaps, breaking people's jaws.
Yeah.
And,
so
you were involved in that.
I mean, unfortunately, the self-destruction, we self-imploded. And so I began to turn against people that look like me. And today, you know, you call it, not you, but the world says black on black gun related violence or black on black violence. And we were the beginning of that. We began to turn in on ourselves.
Yes.
So,
and it escalated, and then with the use of guns, many of your friends.
We had our, I think in our gang, we first held a gun at 14 years old.
And a number of your friends died.
Yeah. Most of them died in the late 80s. The last one died in 89. 9 of them were shot dead. The last one was shot 57 times with 2 Mac 10s. He was shot in Brockley, southeast London at 5:30 in the afternoon. 2 weeks previous to him being shot, I had actually told him, leave the lifestyle, because I had been shot at and the bullets missed me and blew the guy's head off next to me. So that was my turning point to say, I need to leave. And I was trying to get him to leave and he refused. And because he had a reputation, he wanted to keep the reputation. But what I was trying to explain to him, there's a younger generation coming through who are more brutal than us.
But so when would you say that you were born again and you experienced a transformation? When did that happen?
I would say in 1989, when the last gang member got shot 57 times, I had been shot at myself so much time, but the significant one was the guy who got his head blown off right next to me, and he had a hole in his head. That was a traumatic experience because up until then, I hadn't seen murders. My friends all died when I wasn't there. So I had only experienced people shooting at me, but I had not seen a murder. I had hurt people, tortured people, broken limbs. I'd done all of that, but I had not murdered anyone. So I began to seek the help of an MP. He was called Bernie Grant.
Yes.
Just
that's right. He was the Labour MP.
He was the Labour MP for
Tottenham.
Haringey, for Tottenham.
That's right.
So I began to engage with him to figure out a way to get out of this gangster lifestyle. And then he met up with Diane Abbott, and so Diane Abbott was the MP for Hackney. And so basically they then took me to America to meet up with a man called Jesse Jackson.
Yes.
And so when I met up with Jesse Jackson, because at that time the National Black Caucus was really a big organization in America. And so I met up with Jesse Jackson, and I would say that was the first time that somebody had spoken to me about the plan God has for my life. Because up until then, I wasn't a born-again Christian, I was religious.
Yes.
Don't commit crime on a Sunday, don't use women, I was about like that. So it's a bit like the Old Testament, I was a bit law. So he began, basically what he done was he began to show me how to look inward, because I didn't even know how to look inward. And he was showing me that God don't look at the exterior.
Yes.
And he was showing, and if you listen to Jesse Jackson, he didn't come across like how Christians are now, where they're trying to kind of maybe force a message down. He did it in such a way that was relative to me as a young black man and as a very angry black man. He did it in such a way where he drew concepts. Like, so he said to me, he used this analogy. He said, how many black men have you seen hung from a tree? So I said, I've never seen any apart from in the Roots. He said he grew up seeing that.
Yeah.
And he said he could have gone the way of the gangs, but he chose the way of Christ. And I said, so I was like, but why would you choose the way of Christ? Because he said it's easy to be angry, but it's harder to love. Because he was showing me different concepts. So I was like, wow. So he was like, and the way he broke certain things down made me begin to self-reflect a little bit more. Because he actually was showing me, racism exists in your mind, but racism doesn't have to control your destiny.
Very good.
And so he began to break down that he did not allow racism, even though he suffered racism badly, he didn't allow it because he believed in God and the power of God. And obviously from there, that's when I began to think differently.
Yes. Now,
my transformation didn't happen straight away. I was still smoking drugs. I was still being violent, but the violence was getting less. I began to, Jesse Jackson also advised me of not only becoming a Christian, but he was advising me about education, because I didn't leave school with the qualifications. So him and Diane Abbott and Bernie Grant began to talk to me about, you God has a plan. Like, so he was saying God has it. I mean, all this was new to me because like,
Sure.
he was like, God has a plan because he said, for those 4 gunmen to miss you, like the bullets, they were like 50 yards in front. How could they miss? They're shooting at you. They've missed. He said that was God.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you,
No doubt about
I
it.
believe Jesse Jackson when he told me that. I did believe that.
Yeah.
Because
God preserved your life
for a purpose.
for a purpose.
And that's when Diane Abbott and Jesse Jackson were saying the purpose is for you to go back and bring those other guys out of that gangster lifestyle.
Yes.
So, and he wants you to show them how possible that is by changing you first. Because he was saying to me, in order to break racism, we have to change ourselves first. And because he's saying blame culture is really bad because he said, you can sit here all day and blame racism, blame the white man for all your downfall. And he said, you'll end up with nothing. But he said, but if you go on the mission for God, then you will end up with something great.
Absolutely. And God did transform you,
Yeah.
both your attitudes and your actions, your belief, your behavior. And
It came with my wife. She's the one that really done it. And I'm going to be honest with you, it wasn't easy because when you're a gang leader like I was, you're used to making decisions on your own. But when you come into the realm of Christ, the decisions come from God. And when you're not used to that, it becomes a battle, a constant battle. So you get a knockback and you want to do something, but you've got to go through God in order to go and do it or to find out what God says about it. And that became a constant battle for me because I felt that the white people should pay. They should pay for the trauma they caused. But that's not how God sees it.
absolutely.
You know, and you know, there's a scripture that he throws up, you know, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And I'm like, so when are you going to revenge then? When are you going to avenge? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm always kicking it like that. And I'm beginning to realize that God's transformation or his hand on my life was to change my perception of white people. And that was a mountain to climb. And the perception was, I realized for the very first time when I got saved, not every white person was a racist.
No, absolutely.
That was the biggest lie, I believe. And I believe this is where the devil comes in. That because I was a child, the devil used that vulnerability to cloud my understanding that there's good and bad in every race. But you don't see it like that when you're being called every name by police officers, you're being attacked by the National Front. You don't see it like that. And as you get older, it gets worse if no one talks to you. And I was very fortunate to have 3 important, and I would say the next important person was Les Isaacs.
Yes.
Les Isaacs was so incredibly important because he took my Christianity to another level. I would say I've had some of the best mentors in my life that you won't get that again. You won't get that. Men will not get that.
And we all need those kind of people in our lives to help us. The Lord did use people. The Lord transformed you. Gangs Line, tell us about that. How did that start?
Well, God gave us a prophecy in 2004 for me and my wife in Barbados. And the prophecy was that we were to train up professionals to engage gang members through evangelism, workshops, and so forth. And so Gangs Line was started really as an organization that would engage gang members where they're at. So we would go into places that most people would never go. We'd go into places where drugs are made. We'd go into places where they keep guns. We're going to places where violence is an everyday occurrence. We're going to buildings what you wouldn't even put a dog in because it's so bad. So we would go into those places to engage these gang members. And Gangs Line got started out of that because what we realize, we can't bring evangelism, or we can't do workshops the way it was done in the past. We've got to be relevant to the young people, or relevant to gang members. And the scripture we used was when Paul was saying, I'm a Jew to the Jew, and so forth. And he was using that analogy to say that he will do whatever it takes to get somebody saved. And what we were saying is that we would try and be relative to these young men and young women to give them an understanding that this is how we got out of this lifestyle. This is how it can happen for you. You understand?
Yes.
And because we were living proof that it worked, we had some good traction, and that's how the whole gang sign exploded from just being an evangelism outreach organization into an organization now which is a consultancy and training company, where we go over the whole, we engage gang members across the country by local authorities. We train all professionals on how to understand gang mentality. So our workshops are in two different ways. So for instance, if I'm in the Caribbean, I will use a lot of evangelism tools.
Sure.
Because the Caribbean is very much a Christian-based setting. In the UK, it's not the same. So that you have to use the Holy Spirit to direct you where to go, because most young people do not come from that background, especially poor white families. They're not necessarily Christian based. So we tend to use a lot of our workshops, and within our presentation, that's when the kind of Christianity comes in parables, but not in the way they would understand it, because obviously, as you know, in England, you can't openly talk about.
But the values and the principles
are all there in our
through.
presentation, and it makes it so. That's the reason why I think our gangs workshops is the most wanted in the whole country, because people realize that what we've put in it is so unique because we've experienced it.
Absolutely. And what's so great, Sheldon, is that now, when you think of where you've come from, you are now an advisor to the Home Office.
Yep.
You advise the police.
Yep.
You're an advisor to Scotland Yard. Yep. And God is using you for a time such as this. And gangs are on the increase, aren't they? What's the current, just give us a few statistics. What's the current situation?
So at the moment, we have 316,000 gang members or people affiliated to gangs. Now, you've got to understand those figures are really not the true reflection. These are figures that the Children's Commission have come up with. I would double that. I would say that we're more in the region of 500,000 individual gang members right across the UK. So if we went by their figures of 313,000, only 7,000 is known to any of the services. That means there are 200 and maybe 50 something thousand no one knows about. And that's where I was saying gangs lines work comes in, because our work is qualitative. We go to places police don't go. We go to places where people don't go. Hence why their figures don't add up. Only 7,000 is known to the social services, youth offending team and probation. But most gang members who are in gangs have not been arrested. Most gang members are still on the streets. We've got gang members now as young as 9 years old who are making £75 a day selling drugs in places of East London, in places in Brent, in places in Haringey, in Salford, in Manchester, in Croxteth, in Liverpool. We've got young kids as young as 9. Now that didn't have to be like that. But what happens sometimes is that when you're sitting around the table with me, the government finds it very hard to stomach some home truths. And the truth is, I actually did say to them over 10 years ago when I sat with Theresa May and Ian Duncan Smith, who was the Home Secretary at the time, I actually said to them, because of social media, it's going to get worse because every young person's got a phone and you won't be able to control what they see on the phone. And they didn't understand that. And now we have gangs that are coming into areas like this, We've got gangs who are moving into areas like this where you wouldn't have experienced that 10 years ago. We've got gangs who are now branching into middle-class suburb areas, recruiting middle-class white kids to sell drugs on their behalf, and those kids are doing it. Why? When you listen to these kids, one of the things they say, they don't feel loved at home.
Yes.
We, in a society, have lost our way. We are more focused on business, ministry, church, entrepreneurship than we are of the number one reason why we're here, to raise our children. And most of us spend more time at work than we do raising our children. And so what happens is these gang members know this. So when they go into these areas and they go into these posh middle class areas, it's easy for them to groom a child because the child don't even feel wanted at home. I had a girl that was on my book, and she said, well, I don't see my dad. So her idea what a man is, she has no clue because she don't see her dad. So she started going out with a gang member from Catford, and she lived in Oxford. So we've got to understand that when there's no love in the home, the chances of your child being groomed into gangs is very high. It's not necessarily about poverty, because there's lots of poor people in the world who don't commit crimes.
Of course.
But there's lots of people who have no values at home, who have no love at home, who do commit crimes. And people need to understand rejection. When a child feels rejection from a father figure, at the moment, we've got 1 in 3 black kids who have no fathers. 1 in 4 or maybe 1 in 5 white kids who have no fathers. How is that possible? How are we living in a world where fathers can be just so absent from a child's life, and yet the church does not do enough to challenge that moral standpoint? Because really, it's the church that has got the morals to challenge that in society, and I don't think enough is done to challenge that.
Sheldon, some awful, bad, dark news, but the good news is, and you are an example, God can take someone like you and transform you and use you for good. You are a trophy of God's grace, and it's been a delight to speak with you. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for joining us on Facing the Canon.
No problem. I enjoyed it.
Wow. I'm so encouraged that we've got people like Sheldon Thomas, and what an encouragement to us that God can take somebody like Sheldon, transform him and use him for a time such as this. And that means if he can do it with somebody like Sheldon, he can do it with someone like ourselves, or maybe some of our prodigal children. Let's believe, let's hope in God's transforming grace. Thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon. Please join us again.